In a recent study, Princeton economists Anne Case and Angus Deaton found that while midlife mortality rates continue to fall among all educated classes in most of the rich world, middle-aged non-Hispanic whites in the U.S. with a high school diploma or less have experienced increasing midlife mortality since the late 1990s. Now, this is due to both rises in the number of deaths of despair, deaths by drug or alcohol and suicide, and to a slowdown in progress against mortality from heart disease and cancer, two largest killers in middle age. Now, the authors suggest that the increases in deaths of despair are accompanied by a measurable deterioration in economic and social well-being, which has become more pronounced for each successive birth cohort. Now, Case and Deaton, they document an accumulation of pain, of distress, social dysfunction in the lives of working-class whites that took hold as the blue-collar economic heyday of the early 1970s ended and continued through the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent very slow recovery. However, one sociological attitude I just don't feel they're taking into consideration is the weight of the cultural expectations on this group. White, non-Hispanic males have the extra burden of expectation of racial and gender superiority, an expectation that has been taught to them from the cradle. And while institutional racism and sexism does give them a leg up in the society, for the workers in that group, it's an incredibly stumpy leg, simply tall enough to lift them above the more oppressed. But the problem with the expectations is that, well, if, despite their superiority, white non-Hispanic males end up economically struggling, their failing can be seen by them as their own fault. See, rather than examining how our economic system has failed them, they blame whoever the news tells them to blame. Non-whites, women, their kids, commies. But often, well, they feel that the fault must be theirs. On some level, it's their fault, that they have somehow squandered their superiority. How else could those who nature designed to be on top fail? The truth is, the myth that their superiority was a lie to divide them from their fellow workers. And we're all living in a downward economic cycle, which is the result of the reindustrialization of the rest of the world after World War II. Okay. See, in World War II, every industrialized nation had its factories bombed to dust by one side or another, except the United States. See, our post-war boom wasn't because our way of life was better, or capitalism was neater, or our freedom was cooler. It's because we had an ocean on both sides. That's it. Bombers can't reach us. That was the reason. Big oceans. But that was not the myth that the American working class was sold. See, we were told we were better and successful because we were Americans. And the epitome of that best myth was the non-Hispanic white working class male. Heck, after the war, they even got their own designation. Middle class. Now, this term actually has no real economic meaning. It was invented to divide the working class by implying that some workers are inherently better than others, and to make that group identify with their employers rather than with their fellow workers. The idea of a middle class has short-circuited the class consciousness of many Hispanic white working class male for generations. So, for a while, the world had to buy American, but not because our products were better, but because everyone else had to rebuild their countries first. But by the late 1960s, Japan and Germany, with our help to help show everybody, how great capitalism is, they rebuilt their factories. England, France, Italy, the Soviet Union, finally China followed. And suddenly the world didn't have to buy American anymore. And by the early 1970s, our boom had ended and salaries for workers started to stagnate. And capitalist investment started to go overseas, followed by American factories. They were fighting to stay competitive in foreign markets. So, fewer jobs here, which means less purchasing, which in turn means a decrease in domestic profits, which means fewer jobs. What was American capitalism to do? I mean, how to keep the workers spending without actually paying them more? The solution to this downward spiral was the credit card. This monetary miracle allowed the American worker to spend money they didn't have and artificially kept domestic spending up. Now, I say artificially because now since wages weren't increasing in pace with inflation, purchasing for each household naturally reached a plateau when monthly debt payments overtook monthly income. Credit allowed the illusion of prosperity to continue well beyond the actual job growth and wage increases for the working class. Only wealthy capitalists, primarily those whose income was derived from domestic financial institutions like credit cards and banks, or overseas industrial production. Now, they saw their wealth increase substantially. This credit-driven false prosperity eventually reached the point where the price of consumer goods becomes irrelevant. The cost of goods and even housing, it comes to mean nothing. All that mattered was the monthly credit or mortgage payment. Now, for many, there was no longer an expectation of ever paying anything off. And for much of the working class, perpetual debt became normal. It was simply the monthly price for the illusion. Economic security was replaced with gadgets, many of them made overseas, that may never be paid off, or homes with 30 or 40 or 50-year mortgages, but which contributed to the illusion of prosperity. Now, through all this illusion, the white, non-Hispanic working class males were told that any economic pressure they felt was the fault of others in the working class, or foreign or domestic, or environmental laws, or unnecessary government regulations on their employers or unions, and finally, maybe just maybe, themselves. Their economic struggle was never the fault of the capitalists who benefited from underpaying them, and it could never be the natural and inevitable consequence of the end of the boom, because they'd been told that America was the always and everlasting winner. But having grown up in a culture that constantly, well, overtly and covertly, insisted that blacks, Latinos, and women were not as smart, well, not as hardworking as themselves, and that workers overseas were inferior simply by dint of not being Americans, why were things worse for the non-Hispanic white male workers? See, if they, even subconsciously, accepted that they were naturally superior in a land of limitless possibilities and prosperity, if they're still not making it, a cognitive dissonance is created. It's two realities that cannot coexist, which result in an irrational, destructive rage. This rage can be expressed loudly and violently at others, or quietly, but equally destructive at themselves. Now, of course, the problem is the narrative is false. They're not superior. And America's economic downturn is by no means their fault. But as the group raised to almost mythic levels of false empowerment, without the class consciousness to understand how those non-Hispanic white male capitalists are still profiting during this decades-long downturn, the non-Hispanic working class male has been left to rage, either against those fellow workers and government agencies that the corporate media tells them, or at themselves. They turn to violence in their battle to regain what they feel is their birthright, or they look to demagogues to promise to restore what they've lost, but they never really had in the case of superiority, and haven't had economically for decades. But many see their circumstances and judge themselves to be losers in a land where they should so easily be winners, and drug themselves to dull their dissonance. That's our opioid epidemic. Or simply shut themselves off with hopelessness and despair. Their lack of hope is a direct inverse of the lie that they've been sold for decades, that prosperity is within their reach because America is a land of limitless and never-ending possibility and prosperity, especially for the naturally superior. In the reality of their economic suffering, this lie torments them and they see no way out. The possibility of a revolutionary solution has been taken off the table for them by those who profit from the status quo. Now see, for blacks, Latinos, women, and many Asians in America, revolution has always been a possibility because we've grown up knowing the table was tilted against us, recognizing the lies spread about us by the corporate media and the demagogues, knowing that we live in a culture where some profited from us being underpaid, from us being denied jobs, being denied housing, denied the comfort of self-worth. Just as, well, all these things were known and understood about their circumstances by pre-World War II non-Hispanic white male workers. But the Red Scare, which was designed to depoliticize them, and the post-war job boom convinced them that revolution was unnecessary, and they spent the next 20 years living in a middle-class bubble, and the next 30 years living in a state of enforced denial, a denial sold to them by a corporate government which needed them to not understand the actual cause of their situation. And now all they're left with is despair. Their only chance is the rekindling of their hope for change. And that hope for change is economic revolution. When they can again see that the path to their survival is not blocked by their failing, it's not blocked by their fellow workers, it's not blocked by government of, by, and for the people. When they can see that those who benefit from their delusion, when they can see them for the manipulators and economic parasites that they are, when they can understand the fault lies not in themselves, but in historical forces that can only be addressed with a revolutionary trickle-up economic rethinking of what American prosperity actually is, then, perhaps, then they will have the hope that they need. We would all benefit from such a revelation.